Okay, I'll start. Greetings, everyone from Riyadh, Saudi Arabia. It gives me great pleasure to be among you today to celebrate the launch of the first forum on teaching writing in higher education that is organized by the Linguistics and Translation Department at the College of Humanities and Sciences at Prince Sultan University. With English being the lingua franca of today's world, and with the increasing emphasis on the use of English language in written communication in both academia and businesses, mastering writing in the English language has become an important skill of the 21st century. It is an essential skill for education, for professional development, for promotion, for intercultural communication, for research, and thus indeed for life. As educators, we bear a huge responsibility to empower our students for great accomplishments in their careers and personal lives, and for outstanding contributions to our society and the world. Having a good command of the English language will open up new doors for our students at work, create significant opportunities for their lives, and enhance and diversify their ability to improve the world we live in. Hence, it is our duty to ensure that we give students the best preparation for mastering English writing. The best preparation in terms of using updated teaching methods, integrating the most recent technologies, providing the needed feedback and scaffolding, and ensuring our students' readiness to pursue lifelong learning. It is this need that has motivated the launch of today's forum that will serve as an annual platform for writing educators to exchange knowledge and expertise and to enhance our best practices to teach writing in higher education institutions. The first forum on teaching writing in higher education partially gains its importance from the added value it constitutes for writing instructors and thus for our students in the writing classroom. Yet, the forum becomes even more significant when the Saudi Vision 2030 and its 3 principles of a vibrant society, of a thriving economy, and an ambitious nation are considered. Having a good command of English writing is a necessity to achieve the 3 principles. With societies becoming more multicultural, economies relying more on multinational interactions, and ambition becoming more global than local. Additionally, today's forum aligns perfectly well with the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs. English writing is at the heart of quality education, Goal 4, decent work and economic growth, Goal 8, industry, innovation, infrastructure, Goal 9, and peace, justice, and strong institutions, Goal 16. Having a good command of English would also greatly contribute to good health and well-being, Goal 3, reduced inequalities, Goal 10, and sustainable cities and communities, Goal 11, again, among others. With the special significance of today's forum, I would like to extend special thanks to the organizers who provided us with this important platform. First of all, my gratitude goes to Dr. Ahmed Yamani, President of Prince Sultan University, and Dr. Heba Hussein, Vice President for the Women's Campus, for their inspirational leadership that encourages all innovative initiatives. My gratitude also goes to the leadership of the College of Humanities and Sciences, Professor Mahmoud Al-Mahmoud, our Dean, and Dr. Alia Mitchell, our Vice Dean, for their continued support of our work at the Linguistics and Translation Department. My special thanks go to my colleagues who contribute to the organization of this forum, Ms. Shazia Khalid, Dr. Shaista Rashid, and Dr. Jamal Said. I also extend my thanks to today's moderators, Ms. Mariam Parker and Ms. Fawzia Goni. I would also like to extend sincere thanks and appreciation to today's distinguished speakers who come from different parts of the world. Dr. Emily Wilson, Al Faisal University, Dr. Hussam Rajab, King Abdulaziz University, Dr. Hussam Al-Din Atiyah, the American University in Cairo, Dr. Muhammad Shamsul Zaman, North-South University, Dr. Nashwa Yamani, Arab Academy for Science, Technology, and Maritime Transport, Ms. Terry Craddock, Oxford University Press, in addition to our Prince Sultan University's colleagues, Dr. Borsha Mustafa, Dr. Melvin Hall, and Ms. Maram Al-Fudir. Now, We have come to the moment everyone is waiting for, which is the start of the first forum on teaching English writing in higher education. I encourage you all to make the best use of this opportunity and see it as a platform to boost our professional development, enhance collaboration, and extend friendship. I wish you an excellent conference. Enjoy the day.
The next speaker that I would like to introduce is Dr. Emily Wilson. Dr. Wilson is a third year, is currently third year as an assistant professor of English at Al Faisal University. She's currently the chair of the English department and director of the Academic Success Center, a writing and tutoring center. Dr. Wilson's research background includes writing across the curriculum and undergraduate writing development. She's from the United States and completed a PhD at the University of Michigan. Welcome, Dr. Wilson. We're really looking forward to your contribution, Dr. Wilson. Just a kind reminder to leave 5 to 10 minutes for questions at the end, please.
Thank you so much, Dr. Dina. It is my absolute pleasure to be with you all today. And I would like to echo Dr. Dina's thanks to the organizers of this event. It is my sincere pleasure to be with you all. So today I'll be presenting to you a workshop. And what that means is that for the first 20 minutes or so, I'll be talking to you about an activity that we did in our new English curriculum this year. And then you all will get a chance to have an interactive experience trying that activity out for yourselves just a little bit so that you can see firsthand what we did and why we thought it was effective. So a little bit of talking, a little bit of activity, and of course, some time for Q&A at the end. So I am delighted to talk to you today about how we in the English department at Al Faisal taught literature reviews this semester through an activity that used visual mapping. As Dr. Dina said, I'm an assistant professor of English, and I'm the chair of the new English department. So formerly we were part of the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences, and now we're in the process of building our own new department from scratch. So there's a lot of things that we're figuring out as we go. I'm also the director of the Academic Success Center. So this is a writing and tutoring center that uses peer-to-peer learning. So we have students at Al Faisal who have excelled in the courses that they support, and they provide tutoring to other students. So we're using the Writing Center as a place that supports some of the new programs that we're doing through the English department. One example of that is that we have piloted a Writing to Learn program in organic chemistry. And one of the tutors in the Academic Success Center is a writing fellow to help support the writing that's happening in this program. So that just gives you a very quick overview of some of the things happening at Al Faisal, and it provides a bigger context for what I'm going to talk to you about today. Because today I'm going to talk to you about problem solving and trying to get creative and innovative in a brand new curriculum. So when things are new, when departments are new, when curriculum's new and everything's changing, that calls for a lot of outside the box thinking. So when the new English department was created, we also had the opportunity to completely redesign our first year composition sequence. So these are the composition courses that all Al Faisal students take in their time at the university. So this includes English classes that are for our business and engineering students, as well as for our medical students. So we want to give them a broad set of communication skills that are going to empower them to communicate well in any rhetorical situation that they encounter. So we are a service department at Al Faisal, which means that we don't yet have a major or a minor in English. We are helping the future engineers to be great communicators in their engineering roles. We're helping the doctors to be effective writers and researchers and communicators. So that's our context. And so in redesigning the curriculum, we realized that one important set of skills that our students were lacking was research skills. So they were encountering research projects in later years, and they did not yet possess that set of skills that they needed to complete those assignments. And so they were teaching themselves. It was bootstrap learning. And we realized that this was a gap that we could address through our first year composition curriculum. So in our curriculum redesign, we have made the second semester of composition entirely research focused. The students choose a topic. They create a set of research questions around that topic. They do secondary research. They generate an annotated bibliography. From that annotated bibliography, then they produce a literature review, which is what I'm going to talk to you about today. But then they also design and implement a primary research project. So they have the experience of designing survey questions. They conduct a kind of small scale study. They interpret the results, and then they explain how those results interact with the previous research that they've done. So it's really exciting. It's also, as you can imagine, with every new opportunity, it's giving us a number of new problems that we need to address. And the problem that we're encountering this semester is that research genres are new to most of our students. This is the first time that these students have done a research project of this scale. And of all the research, all of the subgenres within the research genre, the literature review is an especially tricky one. So this has created a set of challenges for us that we have been working as a faculty to try to creatively address. So I want to talk to you just briefly about, what is it that makes the literature review such a tricky genre? Now, the activity that I show you can be applied to any tricky genre. Hopefully you can find different applications for it, but there are some specific things about the literature review that make it very hard to teach, that make it hard for students to write. And those are challenges that demand very specific solutions and very creative thinking in terms of scaffolding. So the first thing that makes a literature review such a tricky genre is the level of reading comprehension that it requires. When you're reading texts that you're going to incorporate in a literature review, it's not enough to simply know what they say on a surface level. You have to really be able to deeply understand those texts. It requires a level of reading comprehension that students may not be used to doing. They might be used to just sort of skimming, getting the general idea. But if they're going to actually use this literature in a review, they actually need to know what it says. Something else that makes a literature review such a tricky genre is that what you end up with is a whole bunch of texts, and you have to figure out how to incorporate them. I think of it like a puzzle. You end up with all of these puzzle pieces, and you have to assemble them in such a way that the whole thing creates a coherent picture. And with so many moving parts and pieces, these students, perhaps they've, really done a lot with essay writing in high school, for example. With an essay, you're taking one theme or topic and you're developing it with your own examples, your own experience, your own perspective. And you may include a source or two, but the central task of the literature review is to bring all these pieces together and get them to speak to each other. And that is a very, very tricky task. It's a lot of moving parts, and students can end up overwhelmed when they feel like, they sort of have their hands full, so to speak, all these sources saying all these slightly different things about this topic. They're not quite sure how to put it together. So another thing that makes the lit review such a tricky genre is assembling that puzzle and really understanding how the texts are related. And this sort of goes back to the reading comprehension issue as well. You have to understand, okay, these two texts are saying the same thing. These two texts, these scholars are kind of contradicting each other. You know, one found things in her study that were very, very different from his study. Others, other times students have to figure out, okay, they're not saying the same thing, but they're approaching the same topic in these sort of slightly different ways. And they have to figure out the nuances of text different approaches. So understanding the relationship between different texts is one of the trickiest things about the literature review. Okay, just trying to keep up with the chat and make sure I don't miss any questions. Of course, I'll leave time for questions at the end as well. What also makes the literature review tricky is helping students understand how to write substantive analyses of texts. Now, in the first semester, the students do a rhetorical analysis. So they have a great set of tools for understanding how authors craft a text. They can say, well, the author is using this rhetorical mode, or they're appealing to ethos here. But they're not necessarily able to generate an analysis that's much beyond, I like this text, or I didn't like this text. And so really helping them figure out how to write what is an analysis of a text that's not a rhetorical analysis and that goes beyond just this is good, this is bad, or this is sort of in between. So that's something else that makes it quite tricky. Another thing that makes a lit review such a tricky genre is that what can end up happening, and we encounter this as well, right? As scholars, we pull in all of these voices from all these different places, and the students' own voices can get lost in the shuffle. So what can happen is it ends up being this pastiche, this sort of patchwork of all of these different people, and there's really no controlling authorial voice pulling everything together. What can end up happening then is that what you have, these students write these really nice annotated bibliographies. Their temptation is just to take their annotations and pull them into paragraph form, so that what you have is just sort of an annotated bibliography written out as a literature review. And of course, this is a different genre, and establishing and expressing the relationships between the texts is the key task of this genre. So we have to make sure students know how to do that in such a way that their voices don't get lost, that their voices are still central. And then last but not least, as I mentioned, making the lit review more than just a list of summaries, going beyond the annotated bibliography. As I've been mentioning all of these challenges, as I was compiling this list, I realized these are all really great learning outcomes. We want students to read deeply. We want them to understand relationships between texts. We want them to generate substantive analyses. These are problems worth solving. It is worthwhile to try to figure out how we can help students with this very tricky genre. The key, of course, is scaffolding. How can we scaffold this tricky genre to help our students get from A to B, get from, okay, I've read these sources and I kind of understand them, to I am writing about these sources in substantive, interesting ways. So as a faculty, we had to sort of figure out, how are we going to do this? One activity that we landed on as something really helpful was visual mapping. So there's a couple of different ways I used this. I'm going to introduce you to one way that I used visual mapping, but I'm sure you'll be able to see that there are actually a number of ways that you can use visual mapping to help your students grasp really tricky genres. So this visual mapping activity had to do with visually mapping sources in a mentor text, in a shared mentor text. So a literature review, a sample literature review that the entire class read all together. Okay. So I want to just very, very briefly touch on what some of the literature has to say about visual mapping as a pedagogical strategy. What does the literature say about visual mapping? Scholars have found that learning through visual maps helps students understand the passage more effectively than other reading strategies such as skimming, scanning, and note-taking. So all active reading strategies are useful, but actually visual mapping is extra useful when it comes to understanding the passage, when it comes to that deeper level of comprehension, which is great. Scholars have also found that the use of graphic organizers helps teachers indirectly motivate students to read and try to comprehend the reading material. The students find it more exciting to work on a graphic organizer by filling it with the information obtained from the reading passage. Such task-oriented activity develops and improves their creativity and critical thinking. So, visual mapping activities actually help with student motivation and engagement. I found that this was absolutely true in my class. When we did this visual mapping activity, students were way more motivated to read and actually really understand the material because they had a purpose. They were going to visually represent it. And I do believe that it did improve and develop their creativity as well as their critical thinking skills. One final quote: the result of the research into the difference in performance between students who used graphic organizers while reading and those who did not proves the effectiveness of using visual graphics by showing the improvement in students' understanding of the content, and specifically identifying the main idea, reasoning, and making summaries. So if graphic organizers or visual maps are helpful for these specific learning outcomes, well, these are all of the learning outcomes that I need for my literature review assignment. So looking at this research, I realized, okay, visual maps are going to be, I think, one key scaffold to help students develop that set of skills they need for this review. So here's what I did. I designed a visual mapping lesson. I set aside 2 one-hour class periods for this. Students were given a sample literature review to read and annotate. So it was a shared mentor text. As part of annotating, they had to identify relationship words for the sources. Any words in the literature review, the sample review, that showed how these sources were related to each other. Words like also, in addition to, in contrast, however. So it's more than just typical transition words. There are words that show how sources are related to how they interact with each other. And the students had to figure out what those words were. So identifying the relationship words was one sort of pre-scaffold that we did for the visual mapping activity. I also modeled for them. I drew a sample visual map on the board using an earlier sample literature review that we had done. So I just showed them, here's one way that you could show the relationships between sources. And then the students broke into groups. We've had such a long time of online classes. We are so digital. Every so often, students just love something really tactile. So I gave them big pieces of paper and markers. And if you want to see a college student get really excited, hand them a marker. It really created a lot of excitement and engagement for the students. So they were told then that they had to use that paper to depict visually the relationships between the sources. So now I want to show you some of the products, some of the results that we got. So this was from an article that was about the effect of English medium of instruction in schools, the effect that that has on Arab students' identity as Arab students. And so there's a couple of different conversations happening in that literature review. So there's sort of this conversation on the left that the student was representing. So there was like one key source and then a few sources that didn't agree, and then one key source over here, and then a couple of sources that came off of that. So this was a student who, as you can see, is very talented. She's into graphic design. And so it's visually quite compelling. But these students did a great job as well. And graphic design isn't their forte, but they were able to show, oh, this person doesn't agree with this person. These people are sort of, building on what this person has said. They're presenting new applications of this material. These people are having a different conversation. Lots of really interesting things that the students are doing here. Here, this student actually used 2 different brackets. So there's brackets going one way, and then if you flip the paper, there's brackets on the other side. So these students actually saw more contradictions between sources. So they kind of created these like kind of 2 opposing camps and then put them on different sides of the paper. So this one, whenever we show samples of student work, we tend to focus on the really successful ones. This one I felt was a little bit less successful. So here the students really focused on summarizing, and the text, the summary text is really detailed, but the relationships between the sources aren't very clear visually. So looking at this, I realized, okay, next time when I do this assignment, I really need to emphasize and maybe even actually limit and say, I don't want more than, other than the author's names, I don't want more than 10 words, because you need to focus on depicting this visually. Because once you've got it mapped out spatially, then all of a sudden it becomes more clear what you can say. And summarizing the sources is not the point of the activity. So this was interesting, but I also realized, okay, next time I'm going to do this just a little bit differently. So how did those visual maps help me address some of the challenges that I discussed earlier? Reading comprehension. This task required the students to understand the text on a deeper level. I could hear, as these small groups were working together to make these visual maps, I could hear them saying, no, they didn't directly contradict. They were coming at the idea from a slightly different angle, but it's not contradictory. So the students in their conversations were actually negotiating the relationships between the sources. This is a very high level of thinking. The problem of having puzzle pieces to assemble, basically what a visual map does is it invites students to do an easier task with the pieces before they have to write out in long prose form this whole literature review. They're doing this pre-writing activity that is easier to do. And so that helps with this, I have so many pieces and I don't know where to put them. They're actually physically placing them first, and then that helps them figure out, what exactly they want to say. Understanding how the texts are related. So it clearly shows relationships between texts, and I can look at a glance and tell which students really understand the relationships between these sources and which students don't. It also forces analyses through expressing relationships. So in that hard task of getting students to write substantive analyses, this is actually, they're doing analytical work and they don't even really know it. And I love those sort of sneaky things that we can do sometimes. So by spatially expressing relationships, that is a new and a different kind of analysis, which is really nice, really lovely. Students' voices were not getting lost because it's their organization of the sources that is centered. That's why that one with the summaries on it was less successful, because the students' organization wasn't centered in that example. It was the sources and the summaries of the sources' ideas were still at the center. But this activity can help students make sure that their voices are absolutely in, front and center. And then as far as making the literature review more than just a list of summaries. So this was an activity with a mentor text to understand how someone else organized their literature review. But I had students do this again. So we did, not with paper and markers, but students digitally created visual maps of their sources as a pre-writing activity for their literature review. So those are two different ways that I used the visual maps for this assignment. All right, so that's it for the lecture part. I want you to dive into this and to see how it could work. So there is a QR code here that you can scan to take you to the document, or what I'll also do is just put the Google Doc into the chat. And then what we're going to do now is I'm just going to give you about 10 minutes to try this out for yourself. So please don't type directly into the document. Everybody's in this one. So if you could just go up here, go to File, make a copy. You can make your own copy of this document. And the instructions are given for you in the box up at the top. Read the literature review below and highlight, first thing, highlight all the words that show how sources are related. And then I've listed all the sources for you here. Then down below, go ahead and insert a drawing. So like create your own little visual map. And we have very limited time. This is a 10-minute try it out and see activity. But see if you can put 3 sources into relationship with each other on a visual map. Okay, so highlight the words, create a visual map. If creating digital drawings isn't your thing, if you have a piece of paper nearby and you just want to sketch it out for yourself, that would be great. But I want you to notice how your interaction with the reading is different when you're reading with a visual map in mind. Okay, how are you reading this differently when you know you're going to be creating a visual map? And then how does that visual map help you see those sources differently? So just sort of notice things about your experience. 10 minutes, and please post any questions that you have in the chat. Okay.
Dr. Wilson?
Yes.
We have some questions and I'll share that with you in a bit, all right?
Excellent.
Mariam, is it possible, please, to keep the questions at the end?
Yes. At the end, I'll do it.
The last 5 minutes.
All right, will do.
So I think some folks are maybe trying to copy paste. If you could instead just go to File and then make a copy. Sometimes if all the text is highlighted, if you hit one key, then everything disappears. So File and then make a copy, and then you can work within your own copy of that text. Google Docs can be a little tricky sometimes. Okay, as you all are finishing up this activity, I would just love to hear if you could type in the chat a little bit of reflection, anything that you noticed in particular as you were looking for relationship words or as you were creating the visual map.
Dr. Wilson, there is one reflection. Dr. Hala Al-Dalbani asked, what level of language proficiency would students need to be, in order to be able to maximally execute and benefit from such an exercise?
When it comes to visual maps to show relationships between texts, my feeling is that you can scaffold that, like you can scale this activity down to the most basic level. So my belief is that, even students who are still learning English proficiency, even though a literature review, like a full literature review, might be outside the scope of what they can do, they can still read 2 or 3 texts on the same topic and be able to discuss, were these texts saying the same thing, different things, or the same thing in slightly different ways. So I do believe that this activity could be used with a variety of different levels. Just it would need to be changed in its scope, maybe in the number of sources used in order to make it more accessible for learners.
Thank you, Dr. Emily.
Mm-hmm. Well, if there's no other feedback about the activity itself, hopefully you got a sense of how this would work from a learner's perspective, what this experience would be like. And now I would just love to take any questions that you have about the activity itself.
There is another question. Dr. Taira Hoke, said, she said, thank you for your presentation. Dr. Wilson, I loved how you shared good and not so good visual maps. How do you manage the vocabulary with students with different levels of English proficiency or English fluency?
Mm-hmm. Yes, and this actually connects to a question also that Hala put into the chat. Does the instructor have to tailor literature reviews to match students' level of competency? I think as far as the mentor texts go, I do alter the vocabulary just a little bit. And your question was also about jeopardizing authenticity of the text. First of all, I choose literature reviews that are much more accessible. So I can't choose literature reviews, in the sciences or anything that's too technical, because my job isn't to give students that understanding of the technical vocabulary. My job is to help them understand how to analyze texts. So it did require a very long time of going through texts to find ones, that were suitable and understandable for a very broad audience and interesting to the students as well. Sometimes it also means only using an excerpt, as I did in the sample. This is just a very small part of this person's literature review, but it's enough that they can see the relationships between the texts. So as I mentioned, I really do think that depending on the literature review you choose, I would not want to alter text dramatically because of that authenticity question, but I think you can change out some of the really big complex words for some more understandable words and still maintain the text's authenticity. But I think it's very possible to do that for sure. Yeah, most welcome.
There's another one. And it says, when you first modeled this activity, what was your focus and what feedback did you give to the group who was not too successful in this task? This is from Nuchia Yahya.
Mm-hmm. So I think the first part of the question is about the model that I generated for them. I think so. I basically just I gave them the smallest and the simplest model that I could, because I wanted to not constrain their thinking. I wanted them to be really innovative and creative in how they came up. So I think I had maybe 3 texts. I had one in the middle that was represented by like a bigger circle. And then I had a few texts coming off of that were in smaller circles. And I said, okay, so this shows that these texts are building on what this text said. The bigger circle means this text is more central and more important. It's given more space in the literature review. And these texts are not as important, they're given smaller shapes. So I really only modeled for them just kind of the most basic graphic organizer, because I wanted them to get really creative with how they did it. Yeah. And then I'm sorry, what was the second part of the question?
The second part was, and what feedback did you give to the group who was not too successful in this task?
So for this one, I didn't worry about giving feedback at that time. I mostly took those visual maps as information for myself. Like, okay, next time I'm going to limit the amount of words that they're allowed to use. The ones that I gave feedback on were the visual maps that they created as a pre-writing activity, because those were the ones that I cared about in terms of what is their literature review going to look like. So the only feedback that from the less successful reviews was for me, I realized I would restructure the activity a little bit differently next time. There was a question here too about what were the most commonly used graphic organizers by students. They got so creative. You know, I have this huge stack of them, so I could only pick a few. One group of students represented different conversations in the literature review as different bunches of balloons. And then she assigned the balloons different colors depending on how they interacted with the other balloons. So we had all kinds of things. We had some that were very, just sort of like a branching diagram, lots of the, you know, circles with lines connecting them, the sort of classic graphic organizer that you think of. We also, there was one student who did like little groups of people with signs, holding signs. And so those were the different authors. So I think sort of visually and creatively representing the literature review, it helped the students to be thinking of this as a conversation with different voices. And I think that was really, really special and really effective as well. Like these are people talking to each other and we can think of them that way.
There's also a question from Ms. Dareen Al-Malki. Were the students given individualized feedback, especially with the less successful cases?
So for this activity, they were not given individual feedback. I showed to them and they showed to each other. They did like a really brief presentation in class of like, you know, here's our sources and here's how we related them to each other. But I didn't have time for individual feedback. I saved the feedback for the visual map that they did, not of the mentor text, but as a pre-writing activity.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you.
If you could please, if you have any questions, put it in the Q&A and not in the chat box because we can miss it there. The Q&A is for where you should put your questions and we will then give it to Dr. Wilson that way. Lynn, I just want to
have one more question here, especially, excuse me, Dr. Emily, because the panelists cannot have access to the Q&A. So we have a question from Dr. Shaista. Thank you, Dr. Emily, for your presentation. It was very informative. I agree. As you said earlier, that students write literature review only, and a research paper is a combination of literature review, methodology, etc. And all these parts are very complicated items for students who did not have any prior knowledge, exposure to research. So when you ask your students to write their own literature reviews, what do they focus on? What do they focus on? Findings and conclusion section, or the literature review of the research paper?
So, yeah, for the literature review, in order to get them to do this really difficult task, we have to make sure first that we spend a lot of time on the annotated bibliography. If they don't have good annotated bibliographies, they can't write a good literature review. And then when it comes to the discussion part, we do a lot of analysis of model texts, of sample literature reviews. And one thing that we notice and read for is, how do they identify the gap in the literature? How do they bring everything together? How do they discuss it? How are they articulating questions that these researchers didn't address? So we spend lots of time with those mentor texts, and that really is the way that we've gotten them. So making sure they have solid annotated bibliographies, and then also spending lots of time with mentor texts to notice in that discussion section, how are they discussing all of these different authors together, and then what language are they using to articulate the gap in the literature that they're going to address with their primary research.
So they focus on review only and skip the methodology section?
No, the methodology section is coming next. So I haven't taught methodologies yet. I'm going to actually start teaching that next week. And maybe that's what I'll be presenting on next year, is how to teach a methodology section. It was absolutely my pleasure. I am so grateful to all of you for your interaction and your great questions. And if any of you teach literature reviews and find cool, innovative ways to help students access this tricky genre, please email me and let me know.
Thank you so much, Dr. Wilson. This is really an excellent way of getting students not only motivated, but also engaged. And it's really, you know, what you've shown really enhances critical thinking and gets them really, you know, involved as to how to link these different, you know, literature that they find for the bibliography. Thank you so much. And we really appreciate you having come on and given this presentation. Thank you.
Absolutely.
Ladies and gentlemen, just before we continue, just a kind reminder for you to put your questions in the Q&A so that we can give it to the presenter at the end of her speech or of a presentation, all right? So are we ready for the next person? Dr. Burchin?
Yes, I'm ready, thank you. Can you hear me clearly?
All right, thank you. Yes, I can. Thank you so much. All right, the next presenter would be Dr. Burchin K. Mustafa. Dr. Burchin's PhD research focused on the way beliefs influence the translation process, and in 2017, he was granted an unconditional pass. Dr. Burchin has taught various courses related to translation theory, translation technology, and translation research methods at Princess Noura University and at SOAS, the University of London. He currently is an assistant professor at Prince Sultan University, where he teaches courses related to critical academic writing and is undertaking translation research studies. Welcome, Dr. Burchin, and it's an honor to have you. Thank you.
Thank you greatly for the introduction. Before starting, I wish to first thank the organizers at Prince Sultan University for giving me the opportunity to present at an extremely diverse and important event that aims to improve how English writing is taught. It's a great honor. Also wish to thank all the panelists for their contributions and all the attendees for their time and feedback. I'll just share my screen now. And if at any point the slides are not moving or my voice cuts out, please let me know.
Will do.
Okay, you should be able to see the slides in full screen format. Is that correct, or can anybody not see them in full screen format?
We can see that, thank you.
Okay, excellent. Today, the focus is on critical thought and a method I'm experimenting with to teach critical thought, which is the use of dilemmas. And within this presentation, I'll start off with an actual dilemma, then offer a definition of critical thought, and also highlight the relationship between critical thought and academic writing. Then I'll look at an approach of teaching critical thought. And then we'll return to Dr. McGreedy's dilemma. And through that, I'll look at some of your answers because I'm going to ask you a question. And I'll hopefully illustrate how the dilemma can help in teaching critical thought. And then we'll move on to another dilemma, Rich's dilemma, through which I will hopefully prove to you circles can be squares. And then I look forward to your comments and questions. Okay, I'm going to now read to you Dr. McGreedy's dilemma. I'll ask you to read it with me, and then I'm going to ask you a question at the end. I kindly ask that you, if you can, give an answer, but if you send the answer directly to me, so not to influence, so attendees do not influence each other's responses. And then further on, as we progress through the presentation, I'll return to the dilemma and to some of the answers. I'll start reading the dilemma now. The year is 1982, in which Dr. R.J. McReady manages the New York Psychological Wellness Clinic. Dr. McReady is frequently visited by David Palmer, who is a Vietnam veteran and a beneficiary of a wealthy and well-known banking family in New York. David has been visiting Dr. McReady's clinic since he was honorably discharged from the US military in the fall of 1975. David's visits to the clinic are funded and organized by the Department of Reorientation. Within this context, Dr. McReady has been helping David overcome his experiences of Vietnam. However, in their most recent meeting in late December 1982, events took an alarming and unexpected turn. David stated that he strongly believes his mother, Brenda Palmer, is suffering from psychosis. David explained that his mother speaks to imaginary characters at night and in the morning denies conversations occurred. Also, David explained to Dr. McReady that he thinks one of the characters who his mother talks to is his recently deceased father, William Palmer. On hearing this news, Dr. McReady became extremely concerned and instructed David to record his mother's conversations and to bring the recording to him to analyze. Dr. McReady accordingly supplied David with the clinic's tape recording equipment. During the next meeting, David informed Dr. McReady that he recorded his mother and then played back the recording to her in the morning. David explained that despite this, his mother continued to deny the conversations. After listening to the tape, Dr. McReady cautioned David on the seriousness of the matter. He told David that if he observes a person is having episodes of psychosis, he is duty-bound by state law to detain them in a psychiatric hospital until their risks to society is evaluated, which could take up to 6 months. Due to the seriousness of the matter, Dr. McReady asked David to wait while one of the institute's drivers brings Brenda to his clinic. Brenda arrives in a short time and is consoled with David while Dr. McReady explains what David has told him. Dr. McReady plays the tape and warns Brenda that according to state law, if a person is observed by a qualified doctor, such as himself, to be experiencing a case of psychosis, it will be mandatory to detain them in a psychiatric hospital. Brenda pleads with Dr. McReady to ignore the entire situation, stating it has been an extremely stressful and confusing time following the recent death of her husband, William Palmer. The question I ask you to offer an answer to is, after hearing Brenda's plea, what does Dr. McReady decide to do? If you could please send the questions directly to me. You can select my name in the comments box, and that way attendees won't be influenced by each other's responses. Thank you, and we'll return to this shortly. I'll now move on to exploring a definition of critical thinking. Critical thinking is essential to academic writing, research, and in the broader sense, it is a requirement for social, industrial, and economic progression. This is because a major component of critical thinking is about assessing truth claims, revising them, and producing new truth claims or altered truth claims. And thus, critical thinking is evaluative and explorative. Critical thinking as a process, for example, Courtall asserts that critical thinking is a cognitive activity associated with using the mind. Learning to think in critically analytical and evaluative ways means using mental process such as attention, categorization, selection, and judgment. Also, critical thinking as a product, as when I use the word product, I mean as a consequence of critical thinking, or what critical thinking produces, it's about making decisions, which namely relates to truth claims. For example, Courtall argues that good critical thinking involves making accurate judgments, but adds that Our thinking might not be accurate if we are not fully aware of the influences that affect it. These can include such things as our own assumptions, preconceptions, bias, dislikes, beliefs, things we take for granted as normal and acceptable, and all these things about ourselves and our world that we have never questioned. In summary, critical thought in a reactive context, that's in a context where the reader, the observer, is reacting to a claim, can be defined as the assessment of a truth claim, and in an active form, it is the formulation of truth claims. In both instances, critical thought requires and involves following factors: understanding what a legitimate argument is, identifying the argument, understanding a legitimate claim, identifying the claim, understanding what appropriate evidence is, that's to support the claim, identifying the evidence of the claim, evaluating the appropriateness of the evidence in relation to the claim, determining if the meaning of the evidence is singular or has multiple possibilities, and thus is not exclusive to the claim it has been assigned to support. That's to say, on occasion, someone presents evidence or some data to support a conclusion, but it could be the case that data may be interpreted in multiple ways and thus produce multiple conclusions. And a requirement or critical thinking involves being able to assess when evidence can be interpreted in multiple ways. In terms of the connection between critical thought and academic writing, the position I take is that they are inseparable at many levels. At the most basic, writing is a means to express, record, and reconstruct critical thought. Moreover, the practice of critical thought is active during the preparation phase of writing. That could be data collection, or thinking about what one is going to write. Also, critical thought is active during the physical writing phase. That is to say, critical thought occurs during the process of formulating meaning. Consequently, writing is not just a medium to express claims that originate in the mind, but writing is a process that produces claims. To give an analogy of this interaction between thinking, writing, critical thought, we can't have a flame without air, fuel source, and an ignition. All three elements are necessary. In this sense, to use this as an analogy, thoughts are thinking about the text, the idea, is the fuel. The process of writing is the air, and critical thought is the ignition, the spark, meaning all three are necessary to enact critical thought, to produce ideas. In essence, it's not always the case that we have an idea and then we express it through writing. It could be on occasions the case that we're thinking about a subject, but the idea materializes during the process of writing. Therefore, the position I take in general is that writing and critical thinking, or the processes of writing, are inseparable from each other. Also, a significant part of writing involves interpreting arguments and evaluating them. For example, Bowell and Kemp contend that argument reconstruction is essentially a task of interpretation. What we are trying to reconstruct, to represent as clearly as we can, is a certain train of thought, of reasoning. however well or badly the arguer may have succeeded in expressing it. This cannot be an exact science, it cannot be mechanical or foolproof. Calls for judgment, a critical but sympathetic eye or ear, and even a certain degree of intuition, of understanding of people or the ways people tend to think in given sets of circumstances, of some typical ways in which people fail to express themselves clearly. In terms of methods used to teach critical thought, they are mainly concerned about disaggregating arguments, which involves highlighting the different components that form an argument. Teaching approaches use example arguments through which the instructor can deconstruct the argument and reconstruct it. That's to say, a lecturer will present, or the tutor, the instructor will present a text which has an argument, and then a task in the class would be to deconstruct the argument and assess if the evidence is sufficient, and so on. For example, Bowen Kemp argued that one of the primary aims of training in critical thinking is to learn concepts and techniques which will help us to express clearly what is wrong with an argument, thereby dispelling that frustration by helping us to assess arguments more efficiently. This helps us in the pursuit of truth. In short, we present an argument, dissect it, and ask students to identify premises, evidence, conclusions, and claims. In addition, students are taught critical thought by writing argumentative essays in which they have to formulate an argument based on opposing views. So there could be two views, and the student undertakes a compare and contrast essay and then presents an argument which view is stronger by means of assessing the strength of the arguments. However, a problem with these approaches is that they start from assessing claims made by others, when really what is under investigation are root issues related to ontology and epistemology, and thus relate to the observer's interaction with reality. In short, what is really under the surface, what we are really grappling with when we apply critical thought, is we are trying to determine what reality is in a given situation, or we are trying to determine if someone's claim of reality is valid, or if their representation of it is valid. As such, pedagogies which begin with examples or focus on critiquing existing arguments are, in extent, ignoring the two very large elephants in the room, which are ontology and epistemology. In short, all humans are exposed to the problems of observation and interpretation. But this method to teaching critical thought circumvents this by asking students to evaluate the claims of others before first understanding how they themselves reach conclusions, and before asking them to evaluate their own judgment process. To give another analogy, it would be like using a device to test a car speedometer without knowing if the device itself is accurate. An alternative approach is to start from the observer, i.e. the student, in that students should be first taught to recognize how their observations and interpretations are subjective and are influenced by their own biases and can rely on unproven premises. In essence, we should get students to analyze how they reach conclusions, claims, before they try to understand how others reach conclusions. Through this approach, students can realize that, like themselves, others face the same problems of one, determining what reality in a given situation is, and two, representing that reality. A way to employ this method of teaching critical, which I've been experimenting with, and this is, I'm purely at the experimental phase, is to use theoretical dilemmas. These dilemmas present an engaging dynamic, offer a situation where students can construct their own arguments, offer a situation where students can deconstruct their own arguments, offer a safe theoretical domain where students can question, where students can question and make assertions, identify schematic responses opposed to ones based on available evidence, highlight the differences between perception and reality, highlight the differences between the premises and claims. And we can return to Dr. McReady's dilemma. Let me see some of the responses, if I'm able. Okay, just a brief glance at some of the responses are reflective of the typical responses students and other people have given. I've shared the dilemma with. Now, this is where it gets interesting. Observers, as stated, mainly assume in one form or another that Brenda is at risk of being detained at a psychiatric hospital. However, the text does not explicitly support this. Rather, it supports the claim that David will be detained. The actual evidence in the text suggests, if we follow the trajectory of the test, suggests that it is David who will be detained. Therefore, when I draw readers' attention to this and they reread the text, they see the difference between their perception of the text, which we can use as an analogy for reality, and their conclusions about the text. First, through analyzing with observers how they came to their conclusions, they can untangle the interaction between data, biases, suppositions, and conclusions. And there is a lot at work in this text. Why are they telling the truth? Why do people assume that it is not David that's suffering from psychosis, even though he's the one who is being treated at the clinic? This method to teach, this is because students, through self-reflection, can identify their argument and separate premises from actual evidence. A hypothesis is, once students comprehend their own problems in perceiving reality in a given situation, reaching conclusions about it, they will be able to search for the same problems in the arguments of others and thus apply critical thought. Also, using dilemmas allows me to target specific research issues. And the dilemma we'll end with is Rich's dilemma, through which I present an argument that circles, or one of the characters present squares. During the fall of 1957, Richie started studying at Georgetown University. It was his aim to graduate with high grades in computational linguistics so he could pursue research in machine translation and synthetic intelligence at the Rockefeller Foundation. However, on his first day at Georgetown University, Richie was overwhelmed by the many diverse student circles. For example, there were math societies, English poetry groups, hot rod clubs, and many different sports associations. Richie was unsure which circle to join, so that evening he visited Arnold's restaurant, a local student hangout, to consult his close friends. Warren told Richie it would be best if he socialized with one of the math circles because students in that group gained higher grades and therefore would improve his grades if he were to mingle with fashion, because he was strongly against Warren's suggestion. Fonzie argued that Richie should avoid math circles and stated that those circles are squares because they never leave the library. Rather, Fonzie recommended that Richie should join the motorbike fraternity, which he described as a cool circle, because students in that group had a higher social standing, and therefore would improve Richie's social standing if he was to mingle with them. The question I pose to students is, after hearing Warren and Fonzie's argument, what do you think Richie should do and why? The typical response to Richie's dilemma, students make a claim that Richie should join the maths circle, which is based on the assumption it will help his grades. However, they derive this assumption on the fallacy that correlation is proof of causation. So through this dilemma, we can explore the issue of correlation and causation. And through questioning their own claims, students can understand that correlation could be due to chance, confounding, or other factors. Ultimately, they realize that correlation is not on its own proof of causation. In short, by using these dilemmas, which lead students to produce particular inferences that are not specific to the text, that do not solely come from the text, that maybe relies on their particular biases, assumptions, they can see the problems in deriving meaning from reality or trying to describe reality. And as I mentioned, the hypothesis is if they are aware in the factors that determine their meaning, how they produce meaning, how they produce claims, that when they're reading the claims of others, assessing the claims of others, they can be aware of these potential problems. I'll end there, and I look forward to your comments and questions. Thank you.
Dr. Buchin, there's a question from Manal Al-Krood, which says, there's no way to check the claims of the sun until he keeps her for a few days. And I think it corroborates what you said earlier.
Sorry, I didn't understand.
It's a comment made, you know, on Macready's dilemma, where the attendee says, there's no way to check the claims of the sun until he keeps her for a few days, which I think corroborates what you said earlier, that, you know, why should, you know, the son be believed when in fact he's been the one that is treated?
There's actually, thank you for the question. Actually, there's a detail in the text. This is the point I'm making, is that there's much information in text that I found that people ignore, and there's claims that they think is in the text that really doesn't exist. In the text, Dr. Macready listens to the tape, and if David was telling the truth, it would be apparent on the tape. If David was lying, there would be no sound on the tape. So at that juncture, when Dr. Macready listened to the tape, he would know if David is telling the truth or not.
Yeah. All right. There's another question, another comment. It says, how do you suggest we use materials such as the ones you use to teach students with lower English proficiency level? And this is from Nuchia Yahya.
If their proficiency level is not at, they could not access this text, then what I would suggest is you create a dilemma that is at their level. You create a problem, you think about some an issue that has assumptions or biases, and you formulate your own dilemma. This Dr. Macready's dilemma, I think maybe 2 years I've been working on it and revising it and improving it.
We have unfortunately come to the end almost. So if there are any more questions, people, please put it in the Q&A so that we can you know, put them to Dr. Buchin. If not, you can always put it in the chat and Dr. Buchin can answer them as we go along. All right. And in the meantime, Dr. Buchin, thank you so much. We really appreciate this. Was extremely thought-provoking, I must admit. I do believe that this is the way one should look at any text, because evidence needs to be found in the text itself. And very often, you know, when students look at it, they look at it subjectively, as you said, you know, and we should view texts objectively and find, if we're going to make an assumption or we're going to make a determination about a text, we've got to find the evidence in the text itself. Thank you so much.
Thank you greatly.
We can have one more question, if you don't mind, Dr. Buchin. It's from Dr. Jamal. Critical thinking, like all research, should help us in the pursuit of truth. But how would we tackle the role of culture and being subjective, especially in this culture?
Sorry, there was a slight cutout towards the end.
Okay, I'll read it again. Critical thinking, like all research, should help us in the pursuit of truth. But how would we tackle the role of culture and being subjective, especially in the culture we are teaching in?
This is the point I was making about that. Really, when we discuss critical thinking, we are grappling with ontology and epistemology. How do we access reality? And culture is one lens through which we access the world. And to be specific, to answer the question specifically, if the culture has a number of assumptions that we make determinations about the world, then we would assess the accuracy of those assumptions. If those assumptions are proven to be true, then we continue assessing the world through those assumptions. In short, the position I take, the viewpoint I take regarding ontology is the realism approach, that there is a reality and we are subjective beings, and sometimes that subjectivity can hinder us from accessing reality, and sometimes it is the only way we can access reality, meaning that it's impossible to understand the world without ideas. Ideas, yes, influence us, but it's not possible to understand the world without ideas. The question posed is an extremely complex question, and I hope I've at least engaged with it, even though I understand I've not given a categorical answer. Thank you.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Excuse me. Can I please chip in?
Sure.
I
Yes.
know that I'm the next presenter, but then because I'm so deeply
Yes,
invested
please,
in
Dr.
critical
Mohammed,
thinking.
go ahead. You're the next presenter anyway.
Yeah, would you please allow me to talk about what Dr. Burchin was talking about, like the correlation between culture and truth?
Yes, please go ahead.
Yeah, I think what Dr. Burchin is talking about, it's meaningful, it makes sense, but then I think we are in social science, we are not in physical science. And in physical science, truth is something like scientific, and then it's objective, like 1 + 1 always makes 2. But when it comes to social science, truth is much like perspective. It's not universal. It's very contingent. And critical thinking is talking about depth. I think the gray spot when social science deviates from physical science, like it's very much contingent, and it depends what you are talking about. For example, culture plays a very critical, I think, role when it comes to perspective, when it comes to critical thinking in social science, because like we are talking about North American, I think, the tool of thinking when it comes to critical thinking. But then, like I teach in our country, the way we define critical thinking is not the way they define critical thinking. Like it's very much subjective and very personal, and very also, I should say, in a way, culturally mediated. So there's no universal truth that critical thinking can bring out or can define. It's very deeply culturally rooted, and also like humans are also very strongly, deeply culturally conditioned. So critical thinking is not something that we should try to universalize. It's very contingent.
If I may add to your answer, one point. Thank you for your contribution, Doctor. One point I'll add is, through my experience and through my research, I found that the sciences also have problems of bias and culture and ideology and beliefs and viewpoints. That yes, at a certain level, the hard sciences are free from this, but also at junctures they are dependent, because yes, we have an observation, we can prove it's real, we can determine it through science. But what does it mean? That's where subjectivity comes in, and a person's culture and beliefs, regardless that yes, they have a basis, but they still have to make a determination. There is that gray area where their perception, which they can draw on their culture, is right. For example, and I will not take any more time, is just to show this interaction between science and culture and ethics, is when a pharmaceutical company, they produce a medicine,
Yeah.
and they test it, they know it works, and they know that, let's say, 1 in 100,000 people it makes sick. At what point is it acceptable, the amount of people it makes sick? in relation to the people it cures. Now that's an ethical, subjective question that scientists make. So there's this convergence between, yes, science, hard science, ethics, morality, and culture. Thank you very much. I won't take any more of your time.
Thank you so much, Dr. Borshan.
That's
Actually,
wonderful.
we need to move on because of the time. So,
Yes.
Ms. Mariam, could you please introduce Dr.
Yes.
Mohammed? And
Sure.
Dr. Mohammed, could you please share screen? Of course, more discussion can be later via email if you don't mind, just for the time. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Mohammed. Thank you
Yes.
for coming. And Dr. Mohammed Shamsu Zaman has been an assistant professor in the Department of English and Modern Languages at North South University, Bangladesh, since May 2016. He earned 2 MAs in English Studies, the first from the University of Dhaka in Literature and the second from California State University, San Bernardino in TESOL. He earned his PhD in English Education from the University of Canterbury, New Zealand in 2015. His areas of interest include L2 composition, L2 acquisition, neurolinguistics, and post-colonial studies. Welcome, Dr. Shamsu Zaman. We look forward to hearing, your representation. Thank you. Your presentation, sorry.
Okay, no problem. So, can you see the presentation right now? The slides that I shared.
No, we cannot see anything. If you could please, yeah, it's not showing.
Let's see.
Can you see the green button at the bottom called share screen?
I can see it, like it shows share
If you
screen.
could just press share screen,
Okay.
and then you can press your presentation, and then it will show.
Okay, now can you see it?
Yes.
Yes, it is there.
Okay.
But
So
if you don't mind, if you can just
about...
make, if you don't mind, if you can just make slideshow so that we see it bigger. You press
Okay.
slideshow.
Okay.
No, next. If you move a bit to the right, there is this icon for slideshow.
Okay, just a second. I think it should be
Okay.
somewhere here, right?
It could be here as well. Yes, it could be here as
Yeah.
well. Slideshow is again to the right. No, to the right a little bit. There is the word animations, and then slideshow.
Which
A
one?
little bit
Oh,
up.
No.
No, not new slide. Animations, transitions, animations,
okay.
slideshow.
Just a second. Oh.
Yes, transitions. Next to it, animations. To the right, animations. The word animation.
Can somebody do it for me, because my screens are kind of covered with all
no
the
problem.
buttons.
Okay. Is it possible that you go to the bottom, please? Because we cannot do it for you. I'm sorry. It's technically, it's under your control. If you can kindly go down with your arrow, go down. Down, yes. There is notes, comments, down.
Okay, just a second.
Yeah, sure.
Dr. Shamsu Zaman, right at the bottom of your document.
Okay, just a second. Okay, animation, yeah, I got it.
Okay, slideshow next to it. Slideshow next to it, there is the word slideshow.
Yeah.
And then you press, which one here?
What? I press what? Excuse me.
Show, I think, custom slideshow.
Okay, I did.
It's 1, 2, 3, 4. From the left, it's number 4.
Okay, from the rest is number 4.
From beginning, from current slides. If you go to the, see the left?
Yeah.
Next.
Okay.
No. Go next, please.
Okay, just a second.
Rehearse timings. Next to it, there is rehearse. No. Up, please. Record slideshow. Rehearse timings. Hide slides. Next to it, there is slideshow. Set up slideshow.
Yeah,
this
I
is
see
the
the
one.
slideshow.
Set up slideshow. This one. No, next to it. Next. Left to the left. To the left. To the left more. To the left more. Set up slideshow. That's it. Here it is.
This one?
Set up slideshow. Next, the one to the right. Only one to the right.
Yeah.
Yes, this one.
Okay.
Okay. Let's not say.
Is it there?
No. Okay, now it's better. It's better now. Okay.
Can you see it now?
Yeah, it's better now. Please go ahead.
Okay. So should I start?
It's not showing anymore, Dr. Shamsuzaman.
Okay, just a second. Okay. So I'm sharing right now.
No, you're not sharing with us. We cannot see it. It's not on the screen.
I don't know what to do. That's the problem in this kind of presentation. I'm sorry, but then.
It's okay. If you just press share screen again. Yes, it's coming now. It's coming. Perfect. Perfect.
Okay, can you see it?
Yes, we can. Yes,
Yes, we
okay.
can.
Sure. Should I start then?
Yes, please go ahead.
Please allow me. Ron, can you hear me?
Please go ahead.
Should I start?
Yes, please go ahead, doctor.
Oh, okay. I'm so sorry for the delay. I wish I were more prepared, but then I was prepared. Always there's some kind of technological glitch. Okay, so I'm talking about academic discourse and then what, how, and why. Then by academic discourse, and I lean towards the so-called area of composition study, which is the North American, I should say, the North American development, and then it is reader based in a way that the first thing that we need to think about by reader based, I mean that when we are talking about North American style of writing, we are talking about something which is like 100% foolproof. Like as a writer, you do the brain work. You don't expect your reader to read between the lines because there's no line between the lines. It's all flatly stated. Okay, and then it's top down. And it's linear, it's also sequential. That means that in a way, it's top down and linear sequential, which I should say that which is very easy to follow and difficult to misunderstand when we are talking about North American academic discourse. And okay, then academic discourse is meant to be consumed by specific discourse community. And by academic discourse, we are also talking about some kind of special kind of text, which needs to be consumed by a specific discourse community. We can also talk about the specific discourse community. Okay, the second thing that we can talk about the three characteristics of academic discourse, like it should be critically intelligent, it needs to be critically intelligent, and then it also needs to be factually diligent, and then it needs to embody semantic sophistication. Okay, and the next thing that we can talk about, remember as well that writing is metalinguistic, metacognitive, and then meta-strategic. By metalinguistic, I mean something, then it just necessarily doesn't mean that if we know language, then we end up becoming a writer. We need to have deeper sensitivity towards language, or we need to have superior linguistic ability in order to become a writer. And then it's also metacognitive. By metacognitive, we know that humans are by default cognitive creatures, but then mere cognition is not enough to become writers. Like we need to have like metacognition. By metacognition, I mean, we need to have deep thinking ability, or we need to have the ability to think about thinking. That is basically metacognition. And also meta-strategic. North American writing is meta-strategic. By meta-strategic, I mean that it is based on some kind of theories and principle. It's strategic, but then applying those strategies in order to pull off a piece of writing is not enough. We also need to bake and bend that strategy in order to become unique. Okay. Okay, the next thing so what is good academic discourse? By good academic discourse, there's a scholar, and she's from New Zealand. Her name is Helen Sword, and then she's from the University of Auckland, and she has 10 characteristics of good academic writing. First, it needs to communicate. Then second, it needs to have craft, and then it also needs to have creativity. It needs to have concreteness, and then it needs to embody courage. It needs to also embody choice, and then it needs to have a gripping title, and then it needs to have engaging opening paragraph, and then it needs to have lots of details, and needs to have a storyline. Okay, these are some of the characteristics that good academic writing generally embody. Okay, so the next thing, writing requires, I'm talking about the process of writing, then writing requires rewriting, then writing and rewriting. These are the three things that when we are talking about teaching writing or learning writing or pulling off writing, that that is based on the theories of North American academic writing. These are the 3 steps and stages that we need to follow. Interestingly, like there's interesting, intriguing research by Donald Murray on that front, and he shows us that there are 3 steps and stages of writing, but then pre-writing consumes about 85% of our time and energy when we write something, and then rewriting consumes about 14% of our time and energy, but the physical act of writing consumes only 1% of our time and energy. And ironically, when we teach writing, we are only dealing with it 1%. We just tell our student to write and they write, but we hardly care about pre-writing. By pre-writing, we also mean generating ideas, reading, researching, thinking, and then jotting down. These are some of the things that we can think about. And by rewriting, the rewriting has also two phases, right? One is editing. Editing is a mechanical process, like it's a mopping up process, and it's a single shot event that happens at the end of at the end of any writing. But then when we are talking about rewriting, we are not talking about editing. Editing is definitely a step, but then we are talking about revising, and revising is a creative, intuitive process, and then it can go on and on and on. You can revise something today, you can revise it tomorrow, and you can revise the same thing 30 years, 40 years later. So revising is something that all writers should think about doing. And then when we are talking about revising, we are not talking about grammar, we are not talking about mechanics, we are talking about the rhetorical dimension of writing. By rhetorical dimension, we are talking about idea, argument, voice, word choice, sentence fluency, presentations, audience, okay? These are some of the things. Okay, the next thing that we can talk about is the L2 writers, like a non-native, similar or different, speaking versus writing. I think this is one of the gray areas that we often don't talk about or think about when we teach writing or when we learn to write. But then, for example, like we often say that, okay, we try to attribute writing skill to the status of native or non-native speaker, but then this is perhaps one of those myths that needs to be debunked, because speaking and writing are completely 2 different modes of communication, and these 2 modes of communication perhaps are unrelated, because we don't speak the way we write and we don't write the way we speak. Writing is not speaking, because writing is a systematic selection and organization of speech. So there is such a thing as a native speaker, but there's no such thing as native writer. For everyone, writing sounds like, every writer seems like a second language writer, given that writing is a learned skill. It doesn't matter that it's the first language or second language we are writing in. If we don't learn how to write, we'll never write. So yeah, I can. And then, unlike speaking, writing is a learner skill. I think that there's also something that we need to be think about, that by default we are speaker. Humans are genetically primed to speak, but then humans are not genetically primed to write. And so if we need to write, we must learn how to write. If we don't, then we don't write, or we don't become writers. Okay, that's what I believe. Okay, the writing embodies, you see, writing embodies these 3 things, and then so it's a grammar, then mechanics, and then rhetoric. By grammar, you know, that the broad rubric. And by mechanics, I mean punctuation, spelling, indentation, and capitalization. Okay, and rhetoric, once again, the rhetorical dimension of writing. Then it's idea, argument, voice, word choice, sentence fluency, and presentation. But then what we also need to be thinking about, what makes good writing good is not grammar. What makes good writing good is not mechanics. What makes good writing good is rhetorical usefulness. And rhetoric is something that we cannot teach, because these are the areas of inductive development, but we still can remind our student that their writing needs to be rhetorically fine-grained, and these are the areas that they need to think about. For example, like think of the sentence, the example that we have: colorless green dreams sleep furiously. You might know that it's coming from the linguistic genius Noam Chomsky, and then this sentence is grammatically correct, but then this is absolutely nonsense. So so the ultimate consideration then when we are talking about grammar, that grammar, something grammatically correct is not something meaningful or powerful, or something grammatically correct can be absolutely nonsense. This is the example. Okay, the next thing that you can think about is the next slide. So some don'ts of writing: do not use not in a sentence. This is not my idea. This idea is coming from Steven Pinker, and Steven Pinker claims that humans are by default believing creatures, and then when we use not in a sentence, that kind of reverses the default, our brain's default system of processing information, so it causes problem in comprehension. So it is better not to use not in a sentence. But then also there are some words where negative not is automatically tucked in. For example, hardly, rarely, seldom. We also can think about replacing not with those words. And then don't use passive voice. The passive voice makes a sentence complex and cumbersome, so it is better to avoid passive voice. Don't use long sentence, which is very good, I should say, which is a very good recommendation, because the longer the sentence, the more the problem to comprehend it, and also to manage it for a writer. Don't use complex words. Yeah, that's also, I think we need to be considering that complex words are complex word, because the simpler you are, the more significant you tend to be. Okay, don't use intensifier. By intensifier, I mean like very, and then extremely, really. Steven Pinker claimed that these extensifiers are verbal flapballs. They fuzz up prose without conveying any new content. And then Strang's observation, and then by Strang's observation, like you perhaps know that there is a scholar who used to teach at Cornell University. His name is William Strang. I think I'm talking about in the 90s, 20s, or 30s. And then every single day he used to come to the class, and then he used to like close his eyes, and then he used to repeat the same rituals, and he used to say that simplify, simplify, simplify. And then he used to open his eyes, and then he used to say that write with noun and verbs. I think that's a wonderful piece of recommendation, because ultimately when it comes to academic writing is all about information, but then adjectives are not information, they modify information. Adverbs are not information, they also modify information. In a way, when we are talking about adverbs, like think it this way, then theoretically an adverb adds to a verb. If the verb is already strong, we don't need an adverb. Adverb is redundant. And also an adjective modifies a noun. If the noun is already strong, so why do you need an adjective? Okay. Then next thing, some do's of writing: use hedging. Hedging means, that we must not go for like absolute aggressive assertive statement. We can use perhaps generally, then apparently, somewhat. Okay, punctuate. Punctuation is a problem. We don't teach punctuation. I do, but most people don't, and they don't care about punctuation. But punctuation is not mechanical or grammatical. Punctuation is semantic. We make meaning with punctuation. Then inform. By inform, I mean that when we are talking about inform, that means ideally in a sentence we are telling our readers who is doing what to whom. That means we need to have that information in place. Okay, simplify that. I'm talking about Strang's idea. Then the simple it is, the better it potentially is. Okay, the next thing that why write? Because if you don't publish, you will perish. That's exactly the reason then why we need to write, because writing is a high-stake activity, and then it is academically, I should say, rewarding. And then if we can't write, we don't survive, we don't succeed. Okay, thank you. That's all I have. Now you can ask me a question, please. Anyone?
Thank you, Dr. Mohammed, for a really enlightening speech on the why and the what and the how of academic writing. The part that struck me was when you said that spoken language and written language, how different it is, and that regardless of whether you're a native speaker, everyone has to adhere to writing conventions, be it
Yeah,
grammatical,
that's
be it
wonderful.
anyway.
I think you got the crux of my presentation. That's the message that I want to send across.
And that was really something, yeah, that is something that is regardless. Yeah, thank you so much for that. Ladies, if there are any, ladies and gentlemen, if you have any questions, you can put them to Dr. Shamsuzzaman now. You can put it in the Q&A box. We've got some, and I'll read them to you. It says, if they say that creativity is a talent, how do the teacher help students to write creative sentences instead of just stating the ideas simply?
Okay, that's an interesting question. And then I'm going to go back to Helen Sird. And then the creativity, like you cannot teach somebody or make somebody creative, because if you teach somebody how to become creative, that's not creativity. Because creativity is something, I should say, it's original, and it's emerging from within. So it needs to have your signature. But when it comes to creativity in writing, Helen Sird is a wonderful definition, like observation. In her research, she claims that like all great writers, so-called great writers or good writers, they are multidisciplinary thinkers, and they are pulling in ideas and information from different areas. And then when they write, they know and care about the conventions of writing, but at some point they discovered that those rules and conventions don't work. So what they do, they come up with their own rules and conventions. That's basically creativity is all about. And also, like the line between creative and non-creative, or creative and so-called critical writing, is a blurry one, or I should say it's a false dichotomy, because Steven Pinker claims that writing which is authentic, which is original, and which is readers friendly, doesn't fall in a so-called creative genre or critical genre. It falls in something hybrid genre. Writing which is easy to follow and difficult to misunderstand. Writing which is semantically sophisticated, which is critically fine-grained, and at the same time, which is engaging and interesting, the way Steven Pinker writes. So every writing that you like is creative, and every writing that you like at the same time is critical, because good writing doesn't exist without these two essential elements of writing. Okay.
Thank you. Dr. Zaman, there's another one. How much of that was doesn't using complex words help students with understanding a complex text?
Okay, like this is also something that I would like to talk. I'd like to explain from Helen Sird, or even from Steven Pinker. Then a word is not essentially like easy or complex or simple or difficult. Like a word needs to be, I should say, it needs to be meaningful, and it needs to be the right word. If a right word is a difficult word, it's still the right word, and it needs to be used. But then there's a perception that which is also coming from George Orwell. Perhaps you remember that Politics and the English Language, and George Orwell has like 6 different principles of writing, and one of the principles is that if you have the easy word, never go for a difficult word. Like, I don't understand why he has been saying that. But then when it comes to difficult word, some people have the belief and also the tendency to go for words which are very uncommon, even sometimes like very difficult to understand. And like there's a term for that, and which is coming from like Meghan Hairstone, like in student writing. She claimed that blue sky paper, when you fuzz up your prose with difficult word. And also like there's a scholar, her name is Sandra Pearl, and Sandra Pearl also have another theory. That theory is the thesaurus philosophy of writing. You get all the difficult word from the dictionary, from the thesaurus, and then you use it in order to sound more sophisticated and more meaningful. That's technically what I'm talking about. So we need to teach our student on that front that the most difficult word that you try to use are not the right word. You can be simple and you still can be meaningful, powerful, compact, and compelling. Okay?
Thank you. Then the next one is, how much of what was presented is applicable when the goal is timed writing, like pre-writing and rewriting?
Okay, could you please repeat the question?
The question is, how much of what was presented is applicable when the goal is timed writing? For example, pre-writing and rewriting.
I got it. Okay, so ideally, writing does not happen the way we teach writing or we tell our student to write. Like there's a word for that, phrase for that in composition study, like that is called writing under the knife. You don't write, we don't write under the knife. Like we tell our student, we give them a prompt and we tell them to write in like for 50 minutes or 30 minutes. Writing doesn't happen that way. So this is I should say, it's the artificial approach to producing writing or to teaching writing. But then the thing that we are talking about, that we sometimes we need to write on the spot there, that's a non-negotiable requirement when it comes to the professional engagement. But at the same time, we perhaps need to teach our student that the way of writing is something that presupposes reflection, that presupposes research, and that presupposes editing. Okay, and so the point is that how much all of these attributes our student can translate when they get engaged to the act of writing. But then we must tell our student that they need to think before they put their pen on the paper. Otherwise, just what you are going to write is going to be glib. Sometimes it's going to be ungrammatical, and it might even, like, I don't know, it might be even ridiculously funny if you start writing without even thinking. I don't know. But then, yeah.
Yeah. The last one, or there was one more after this, but the attendee wants to know, how does the teacher help students not to translate the idea from source to the target language? In other words, where they shouldn't use Google translation because they use it a lot.
Okay, so I'm one of those people who believe that translation is not a crime. It's a positive attribute when it comes to writing. And then there's some research on that front as well. Perhaps I think the best book that I have ever read by Eva Hoffman, Lost in Translation. And then also perhaps another scholar from that part of the world, Edward Said. Said has in his memoir, like Out of Place, he was talking about that like I write with almost but never native like fluency. Think of that. He's perhaps the most influential intellectual of the 20th century, 21st century. But this is exactly what he said. And then there's another essay by Edward Said, and in that essay, the title of the essay is perhaps No Reconciliation Allowed. And in that essay, Said said that every sentence that I write in English has to resonate in me first in Arabic. Now think of that. If Said, a scholar of his class and caliber, has to translate, then what's wrong with our student to translate? It's not that we should discourage our student to translate. Perhaps we should think of streamlining how that happens. But Eva Hoffman said that that in her memoir, like Lost in Translation, that language learned subsequently is not the language that you perhaps would like to have your innermost thought transcribed. So you get the point. The translation, if your first language is not your target language, then I should say your first language will always somewhat affect you, influence you, persuade you to borrow from it. And we do, like, also, like, my area of interest is second language writing, and there's a scholar leading scholar in second language writing. He's Paul K. Matsuda, and Matsuda claimed that non-native writers use translation as a strategy to write in English. So if they do, then I don't know how we should be using Google Translation. That's something that our students know better than we do. I know. But then translation should somewhat be used as an informed strategy to help our students advance their writing goals. I don't know how that's going to happen, but it's about time that we think about that. Okay?
Thank you, Dr. Shamsuzzaman. Finally, Shazia wants to know, what lessons can a writing student take away from this talk?
Okay, then the first thing that a student can take home from this talk is that writing is a learned skill. Okay, it's not a gift. like in Asia, in South Asia, we tend to consider that all so-called good writers and great writers are gifted writers. No. They learn how to write, and then so if you don't learn how to write, you are not going to be a writer. And then also, like, becoming a writer presupposes extensive reading and regular writing and deep thinking. And also, becoming a writer presupposes dealing with a lot of frustration, because no writer knows exactly what he or she is going to write until he or she writes. And whatever he or she writes is not whatever he or she wants, because we never write what we want to write. We always write, we always write what we can write. So there's a gap between expectation and execution, and writer must deal with that as well. And the last thing, the magic of good writing is revisioning or revision. So we must help our student how to revise. What this means is that don't teach writing as a product, teach writing as a process. Okay, so, and we must tell our student to initiate the process of writing as they write.
Thank you very much, Dr. Shamsuzaman, for really an informative presentation. Ladies and gentlemen, if there's
you agree
anything
with me, Ms. Mariam, an excellent closure for our first theme, pedagogy and practice, to say we never write what we want to write, but we always write what we can write. As a writer, I mean, this really made me really reflect. So thank you very much, everyone, for attending the first theme, the first part of our forum today on pedagogy and practice. We take like 25-minute break. We'll come back at 12:30 to start the second theme of our forum, which is writing context, with 4 more speakers before we move on to more themes. Thank you very much. Enjoy the break and see you at 12:30.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you for the wonderful honor and opportunity. And I'm really sorry for the initial, the technological glitches. I think it happens,
That's
absolutely
all right.
okay. Absolutely okay.
Thank you.